People get upset about chlorinated chicken, which is a complete misnomer. But the US produces so much more food, many of which we're already importing, such as soybeans and corn, because we can't grow either here. We've kept those tariffs high, even though you can't grow oranges or produce orange juice in the UK, but that's to protect Spanish farmers. And we've maintained them, even though they make every consumer in the UK a little bit poorer.
A couple of weeks ago, I was joined by Catherine McBride to talk about her work, and in particular, her recent Substack series on the UK's doom loops, debt spirals, and dumb taxes. Catherine is an economist, an expert in trade policy, taxation, commodities, agriculture, and financial services regulation. As she says, she writes in order to give a new perspective on traditional media, misdirection, and spin. She has over 30 years' experience in financial markets as a member of the UK's Trade and Agricultural Commission. She's also worked in think tank land and has had her work widely published. She has worked for the Campaign for Independent Britain, the Institute for Economic Affairs, and the Tax Reform Council, and she's always striving to provide clarity to complex economic challenges. However, Catherine does not come from an ivory tower, but approaches her work armed with lots of practical real-world experience. She has worked in a variety of roles, ranging from strategic planning to trading financial derivatives. In our fascinating conversation, we discussed the state of the UK economy and how we got into this world of debt spirals and doom loops. We asked, what is the outlook for the upcoming budget? What are our dumbest taxes? And when and how will this or a future government be required to roll back the size of the state? Finally, we discussed the way the world has changed under the emerging Trump tariff regime, why most people don't really understand it, and how Britain can benefit from it. Spoiler alert, she thinks we already are. Catherine's perspective is as refreshing as it is challenging to today's widely accepted mainstream view of decline and despair. However, as always, none of what you're about to hear is any kind of advice, but hopefully you will find it informative and enjoyable. Please take independent financial advice before investing a penny of your money in these crazy markets. With that said, please enjoy my conversation with the maverick economist, Catherine McBride.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for joining. Can we just start with a bit about you and your background and your journey into being such a widely recognised voice in areas of trade and taxation?
How this started, it's my entire life, because I grew up in Australia. And Australia at the time, there were only 17 million people who were widely dispersed around a massive continent, and they relied very heavily on trade. They didn't have the internal market that the UK has. So even as a child, the maps you were given had little sheep where the wool came from and little picks and axes where the mines were. And you sort of understood commodities, where they came from and where we sold them to. And at the time, a lot of it went to the UK. The UK joined the EU, and Australia then had a problem where so much of its commodities had been sold to the UK, and they had to find new markets, and they had to really look at what they were producing, because a lot of the things they were producing suited the UK taste, if you like. You know, Australia had to find new markets, and they had to start producing what those markets wanted. And so it was a sort of, trade is just part of what you do in Australia. It's what people know about. When I came to the UK even, I was working with an Australian stockbroker selling derivatives to UK funds. Almost all of the companies that the British were interested in were the Australian commodity companies, the mining companies. So again, everything you did was about trade. I was headhunted to Baring Securities before it blew up to develop the European markets for derivatives. That was how I sort of got interested in the whole European Union, because it was very obvious that these were very different markets. And it was at that time that the ERM existed, and we'd pegged the pound to the Deutschmark effectively, which was not clever, didn't work for us.
You just can't force markets into places they don't want to go.
Yeah, and also it's an attitude thing. What Angela Merkel used to describe as the Anglo-Saxon capitalism, the British and the Americans are quite happy to list their companies. I remember going to see some Germans about listing, and they regarded it with a great deal of fear and said that anyone with a profitable company would not want to list it. They'd want to own it 100% themselves. And therefore, any company that was listed must be a dangerous thing to invest in. And you will still find some of the biggest companies in Europe are privately owned, or majority privately owned.
Yes.
So we are very different animals, and we were then. And that's why I was very much against the pound joining the euro. In fact, I was very much against a lot of countries joining the euro. It was never going to make sense for Italy or Greece to join the euro. And I never believed they would make it over the debt hurdles to do that. But with some clever banking, offshore maneuvering of various things, they managed to get over the line, which I'm sure they have regretted ever since. It was always a bit of a strange time, but that got me interested in the whole Brexit thing. So as you're probably aware, not only do I write about trade, I'm also quite a cheerleader for the whole Brexit idea. I can't say that it's been done as I would have done it, but anyhow, we're getting there. And we do have a lot more freedom than people often understand.
The world, in my simplistic lens, currently seems to being run, or tried to being run, by politicians and NGOs who are schooled, shall we say, from a more theoretical perspective. I find it very interesting talking as I do to people and reading people who write up their experiences. I don't know, talking about ERM. I mean, George Soros's books on investing are way outside sort of accepted norms of how you should approach financial markets from a theoretic perspective. But they're fascinating reads, and it's written from the perspective of someone who's actually achieved the sort of 1 in a million shot. So, yeah, I just find this very interesting that we seem to be long of people in the world today who are short of practical experience.
And they don't trust markets.
Yes.
I'm intrigued at how many people will call themselves a free market economist, or they
want to trust the spreadsheets. Isn't it deeper than that? I'm beginning to think that people like, for example, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer don't trust fundamental human motives. And I think it runs as deep as people being suspicious of people who overtly acknowledge what drives human behavior.
For sure. And it's not just Rachel Reeves. She's obviously getting a lot of advice from the Treasury, and they've allowed some think tankers who've never had real jobs to also get into safe Labour seats and advise her. Yes. I'm talking about Torsten Bell, obviously.
Yeah, man of the moment.
Yeah, these people don't trust markets, and they don't understand that if you give people an offer, everyone will work out what's best for them.
Correct.
So if you put a tax on selling...
Including one Angela Rayner when it comes to buying another house, so we're told.
Yeah. In terms of people working out how they can not work and claim benefits and teach each other on the internet how to pretend to have a mobility issue and get a new car. The people in the Treasury, it's never occurred to them that people will work this out and work out that they can get up every day and go to a really dead-end job and work long, long hours and make half of what they could get if they pretended to be sick. And it just never occurred to the Treasury that people would pretend to be sick, and that if they didn't actually have to turn up and prove that they had a mobility issue, then they might lie about it. You know, it's just an insanity.
It's rational human action in many ways. It's sort of contorted entrepreneurial spirit that are just adapting to the rules of the game.
They are adapting to the rules of the game. Because there is this attitude, I think, in the Treasury, they think all people are stupid. And they don't realise that everyone sits down and works out how to win at Monopoly. or how to win at Scrabble. And the Treasury wants to sort of be in charge of everyone, do everything for everyone, make everyone reliant on the Treasury for money. And this is going to end in tears. They're just not smart enough. You've got to let the market do its thing, and it will.
Yes. What's your overall assessment of the UK economy today and its immediate outlook?
I think that the outlook is very dire. After we see this year's tax collection, I think things are going to look very bad, because I do believe many of our largest taxpayers have either left the country or decided to stop working or work less so that they get taxed less. And I think our key industries are pulling out of the UK very fast. And this is, as I have written many times in my Substack, I'm hoping you've read them, but the first doom loop and also in North Sea Oil to the Rescue, I go through how dependent the UK economy was at getting out of the 1970s debt problem, where we had to go to the IMF for a bailout. And the thing that really saved the UK at the time was North Sea oil discoveries and people developing North Sea oil and then later North Sea gas. And that is a huge industry for us, not just in the employment, but also in the money it brings in terms of revenue and the trade exports. It was huge for the UK for a long time and was the reason that the UK was so buoyant in the 80s and the 90s. And for some ideological reason, there is no economic reason to do what Ed Miliband started doing when he was the energy minister under Gordon Brown, or Tony Blair, I think maybe, 2008. He's continued to do, and the Conservatives in the time they were in power didn't change any of this. And so we've been running down an industry by overtaxing it and also by allowing activists to take it to court. The government has approved 2 sites, the Jackdaw site and Rosebank site. It took like 17 and 19 years for those 2 sites to get approval from the government. But now they've been held up by activists, and now a court ruling on another site, they're saying they have to take their Scope 3 emissions into account. And of course, if you look at the world's production of oil and gas, it's just gone up and up and up.
Yep.
There's been no change. So the fact that the UK is producing less has not changed world production of oil and gas. You know, it just means that we are getting poorer.
Yes.
That's the only outcome of this. And the taxes the government is collecting. The OBR wrote a ridiculous report when Sunak was Chancellor, and he introduced this stupid levy on the oil and gas profits in 2022 when we desperately needed more oil and gas. He decided to tax them, which is insane anyhow. But when the OBR thought they'd get about £20 billion from this tax, and it's a fantastic example of the Laffer curve in action, because we've got less and less. I think the most we ever got was 9 billion, and it's just fallen and fallen and fallen. And now the OBR thinks we might get 3 billion this year and 2 billion next year. It was just a nonsense. The idea that politicians with no concept of reality, who didn't realize that if you tax an industry, especially large multinationals that have other sites,
other options,
they don't need to be in the North Sea if the North Sea is going to be taxed out of existence. You know, and this has been used very disingenuously by a couple of politicians, most noticeably the fellow that wants us to rejoin the EU so desperately, a man called Nick Thomas Simmons. He is claiming that UK exports are down by 20%, which is not true. He's actually made that figure up. But he's trying to blame that on Brexit and claiming that if we let the EU make all of our food and animal welfare and pesticide laws, that somehow this will increase. But in fact, the big drop in UK exports is all to do with oil and gas since 2019. Our fuel exports, which is mainly oil and gas, we don't really export other fuels, are down by 36% since 2019. And this politician is trying to claim that that's to do with Brexit. and is trying to claim that if we just let the EU make all of our farming rules, then this will go away. Well, it won't. This will only go away if we get rid of all of our net zero rules and get rid of our silly taxes. And the chemical industry used to be the UK's second biggest export industry, and that's down by 18%, and that's going to be lower next year because our big chemical production facilities are being closed. Because INEOS, which we like to think of as a UK company, is actually a large multinational, and they have a lot of customers all around the world, and they have a lot of other places where they can build these things, or they already have the facilities going, so they don't need to stay here. And this is the insanity of our taxation system, and how rather than fix it, members of the government have just used the figures to lie about it and say that somehow the tiny exports the UK makes in food and live animals to the EU will increase. And it's like, no, these numbers we know are going to decrease and decrease and decrease because of your taxes. So the 36% drop in oil and gas exports is between 2019 and 2024. When we put 2025 in, that number's only going to get bigger. We already know that because we've got two oil refineries presently closing, or one's already closed, one's in the process of closing. So we will be exporting less oil and gas this year than last year.
You write very eloquently about debt spirals, doom loops, and dumb taxes. You paint a picture that is becoming more widely seen in mainstream media about the UK approaching a cliff edge and some form of financial crisis, economic or financial crisis. But sterling is up this year and is trading above the average rate it's traded at since Brexit. No one's told the currency markets.
I agree with you on that. It is something that intrigues me. Now, of course, obviously the currency market you're talking about is a relative market.
Yes.
And basically it is...
Donald makes it easier for everybody, doesn't he?
Yeah. And so rather than the UK increasing, I have a suspicion the US and the euro decreasing, and they're decreasing faster than we're decreasing. We're probably all going down. If you could measure us against the currencies that should be going up but aren't because they're controlled, which is, of course, the Chinese currency, which is very actively fixed to prevent it from increasing, because this is the world's largest exporting market. And the whole theory of a floating currency is if you're exporting a surplus year after year after year, your currency will rise to account for that surplus. Of course, that's never happened with the Chinese currency. Meanwhile, the nations that do have a genuine floating currency are all moving together, probably downwards. But in the UK's case, we're not falling as fast as the US or the euro. And I suggested this the other day to someone who was asking me about the 30-year gilt market. Now, the 30-year gilt market is not the major market. Most of the trading is always going to be in the 10-year. But if you were a large investor, you probably were at one stage, I think that's your history. If you were going to put money somewhere for the next 30 years, would you take a gamble on the UK? And I'm pretty sure I wouldn't, because in 30 years' time, unless we get rid of this government and we get rid of the other government too. I mean, the last 20 years of governments have been ridiculous.
Get rid of the lot.
On ridiculous things. They are run by children. They are advised by children. I mean, I worked in the city for a long time and then went into think tank world. And I was intrigued to see how many people in the think tank world were either university professors, tenured professors who'd never had a real job, or they were children who'd come straight out of school or university.
Yeah.
The same university professors had read a book to them and they didn't understand. And they've been running this government and the last government and the government before that. So we've got really stupid things happening in the UK. And so I wouldn't be buying 30-year gilts at the moment either. And one of my big reasons for not buying it is I think the premium on the 30-year gilt over other markets is our currency. Because I think the European markets, there may be a default risk, but it's trickier with the euro. But they won't have the same currency collapse risk over the next 30 years. And if we don't have oil and gas to export, and we don't export our coal, and we don't use our coal, and we keep importing our coal, I'd really like to know what the government thinks they're going to be exporting. I mean, we export a lot of services, but we will need to import fuel. We will need to import building materials. There are goods you need for life in the UK that we no longer seem to be able to make here. I mean, it just makes no sense.
I think it's a relative game, as you pointed out. And if you use a faulty ruler, it tells you more about the person using the ruler than the thing you're actually measuring. And I think that there's a lot of credibility around the view that the real ultimate measure is something like gold, which is no one else's liability. The fiat world is blowing itself up, and we're all in a relative race to zero. I mean, all fiat currencies through history ultimately tend towards their, I don't like the word, but intrinsic value, which is zero.
I'm always slightly suspicious of gold because I remember quite well in the late 70s, the early 80s, especially in Australia, there was a massive gold boom. Everyone was investing in companies that claimed to have found gold somewhere.
Yes.
And
big hole in the ground with a lyre at the top. As,
exactly.
Yeah.
And there are some notorious stories about that. And the gold price hit over $1,000 US. I think it might have got to 1,200.
I think it did in the late 70s, early 80s, didn't it?
Yeah. And then it just died and it never came good again. And everyone sort of walked away from gold.
But that's when Volcker was doing his business and restoring faith in fiat currency, which I think that one single act kept the system afloat for the following 40 years.
And of course, that was the problem with gold. You get no interest rate. So as interest rates go up, generally people are less inclined to hold money in gold. But you're right, there's been a big international change. And now two countries that have always, as a cultural issue, believed in gold, not so much to back a currency, but as the general population will keep their money in gold. And that's India and China.
While I agree with your thesis on doom loops and debt spirals, it doesn't seem to be it's certainly not a unique feature of the UK economy. We seem to be competing head on with France right now, who can get to the front door of the IMF first.
That is definitely true. And I think it's been very strange alignment of all of the Western nations over the last 20 years, where they were all following the same quasi-liberal ideas. They all managed to do almost exactly the same net zero agenda. They all seem to have large influxes of immigrant populations at the same time as they make it too expensive for the local population to have children. And they're all doing the same thing, and it all seems to have fallen apart at the same time because it was never a smart move, and it was probably developed by the people who've never had a real job that we talked about earlier. So I am always surprised that when I go back to Sydney, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, Australia, when I grew up, had a population of 17 million. It's now got a population of 25 million, but it's still a massive continent.
Yes.
And yet people in the Sydney will complain about the cost of housing when any fundamentals of supply and demand must tell you that they cannot possibly have the same problems with the cost of housing that people have in London, but they do somehow or other. And you sit there going, that's ridiculous because the UK is the exact opposite. It's 1/30th of the size of Australia and has 3 times the population. There is no way you've both got the same problem, but somehow they do have the same problem because they've all been following the same dodgy government approach to life. And, Australia has huge mines of coal, as does the UK. Neither of them should have an energy crisis, and yet both of them do because they decided to walk away from their natural advantages of coal and oil and gas and adopt things that they cannot make themselves. Neither of the countries have the ability to make a solar panel, and yet both countries have governments that are paying people to put in solar panels.
Yeah.
Now, the good news is, at least in Australia, you have a lot of sunshine, and they do get so much energy from solar panels that, like windy days in Scotland where they have to turn the windmills off,
Yeah.
there are days where they have to turn the solar panels off. But it is kind of crazy that Australia doesn't make solar panels. They have to import them from China. But Australia does make coal. We don't need to import that from anywhere. But we're not doing that. We are exporting coal to China so they can use it to make
Solar panels.
and we can import the solar panel.
Yes.
And you just look at that and think there's something gone horribly wrong at the government level if people think that makes sense. And I'm pro-free trade. I'm a big trader.
Yeah.
But I would only trade in the things that you export.
But that's a gross distortion. What you're talking about is a distortion of free trade, isn't it?
It's the most ridiculous thing where you refuse to use your own product and you send them to someone else and let them use it. And you somehow claim that this is saving the planet.
I'm talking today about the FCA investigation of some allegations around Drax, the UK power generator. And it derives from an allegation made in an employment tribunal from someone who's sort of blowing the whistle on them, saying they're actually misleading people about the sources of the wood pellets that they're importing and that they might not be coming from, I don't know, offcuts or genuinely renewable sources. I think it comes at a time when it's just going to be shining a light on complete absurdity of UK energy policy, that we have closed down the largest single source of coal-fired power generation in the UK and converted it to imported wood pellets that is a much, much lower density. I mean, there's a reason why we stopped burning wood in the world and started burning coal. It's not difficult. Yet we've turned off that supply of energy, and then we now import wood pellets at much higher emissions with just in the transportation of these wood pellets involves higher emissions. And yet we're told it's a renewable source because for every pellet they burn, they plant the equivalent in a new growth forest.
I wrote about it 2 or 3 years ago.
I know. Yeah, I remember.
Eventually, Kwasi Kwarteng did actually declare that maybe it's not quite as green as they thought.
I remember.
Because it did start as a really good idea, because so many US houses are made of wood, or they're wood frames. And there's obviously getting, 4x2 planks out of a round trunk is you're going to get a lot of leftovers. But the process of turning it into pellets, because not only do they have to turn it into dust, then put it together, they also dry it out. It's quite an expensive process. And then to send it to the UK makes it really silly. But we burn in 20 minutes what takes 20 years to grow. So that the basic physics or the time doesn't make any sense. But the idea that we've turned Drax into burning this stuff rather than just let it become a more efficient coal-burning electricity producer. If you look at the improvements we've had in petrol cars, in the emissions of petrol cars during my lifetime, but even in the last 20 years, there's a fantastic study of this done in America that in the 20 years from 2000 to 2020, the emissions had come down by 80% in cars, even though there were many more cars on the road. And it wasn't to do with electric vehicles. The proportion of electric vehicles was minuscule. And this massive improvement had happened because we'd improved the engine design. We were making more efficient cars.
I was reading this morning, there's a new car being launched recently by BYD. It's a hybrid vehicle. It's not an EV. And it can do 2,000 kilometers on one tank of gas.
Wow. I'm a big fan of hybrids. I actually have one. And I have never understood why we have this insane idea that we need to go to electric vehicles when the whole idea of a hybrid car is so clever.
It's all to do with net zero absolutism. There's no concept of
it's less than that, Gerald.
Okay, all right.
It's not net zero absolutism. It's net zero designed by an English or history major. It's designed by someone who never did physics or chemistry or any basic science.
Yes.
And they never thought about, and the hybrid is a market-driven thing. You let the market work it out. I'm a big fan of what Trump has said in the US. He didn't ban electric vehicles. He said,
No.
we're not going to subsidize them anymore. You work out what you want. You pay for it. It's your problem,
Okay. Okay,
And
got it.
that is what the government should do. And if they had done that, honestly, people would have worked out that hybrids made the most sense, as the Japanese did, because the Japanese, I think, invented the hybrid. They certainly got into it bigger than most other people, but they also were working on hydrogen fuel cells and things like that. And they got into that first. And quickly the market sort of worked out that that doesn't make any sense either. You take more energy to produce the hydrogen than you're saving. You may as well just stick with using a real dense, as you correctly pointed out. You need energy density is so important.
I wanted to bring you back to the UK and the UK's fiscal position. And Rachel, we've got a long haul now to the autumn budget. We're going to have all these headlines coming from Torsten Bell and other people about what they're going to tax and what they're not going to tax. You've written about dumb taxes. Can you just give us some examples of dumb taxes in the UK? And if there are dumb taxes, are there any smart taxes, I suppose, is the follow-on?
The bulk of our taxes, over 80%, come from taxes that are cheap for the government to collect because companies collect them, and they raise a lot of income. So basically, PAYE and national insurance, both paid by the employer and the employee, raise over 50% of our taxes, of all the taxes we make. And then VAT is another 20%, and corporate taxes is about 11%. So those four taxes cost the government nothing. People collect them every time you buy something. The shop sends it to the government. 81% of our tax collection. And then we have, incredibly, another sort of 30 tiny taxes that raise very little revenue. As I mentioned earlier, the key dumb tax we've done is the energy levy, which was on top of, we already charged energy companies 40% tax. And that was to compensate for the fact that they were making money from a national resource. So at a time when the rest of the corporations were paying 19%, oil companies were paying 40%.
They're
and
now
they
paying 75%,
was okay. So they continued in business. That was all.
Yeah.
But then we increased it to 75% and now 78%. And they're all going out of business. So they don't think that's fair. So that is a dumb tax because we increased the tax, but instead of getting more revenue, we're getting less revenue because people are not producing as much oil. And so the tax that they thought they would get 20 billion from this year, they might get 3 billion from. It's like completely silly. It's the Laffer curve in action. They thought they put the rate up to a ridiculous amount and people would just keep paying it without looking at the kind of companies that were there and realize that that's not what they're going to do. Another dumb tax that comes up time and time again is the extra tax on employment, which of course encourages companies to employ fewer people. And as one of our big tax collection, in fact, our biggest, PAYE and national insurance, it's over 50% of our tax. But if you put that up, small businesses are going to say, well, sorry, we used to employ 5 people here. We're going to have to just employ 4 now. And that might look good on a productivity curve or something, but it doesn't raise you more revenue because people stop employing people. The taxes on the non-doms and the very wealthy. And the main reason non-doms were leaving, and they already were paying like 60% of our taxes. The top 10% of the country were paying 60% of all income tax. So we really rely on these people to keep paying that. And instead, we're encouraging them to leave by threatening to tax their money that they have outside the country with inheritance tax. Now, this is a really dumb tax because, A, you don't get it till they die. So announcing it now just made people leave, even though many of them are in good health and probably midlife and might live for another 30 years. But B, it would be very difficult for the government, HMRC, to actually collect that money. Because if the assets are owned in India, say, The Indian government probably thinks they own that money. You will be fighting with other countries saying, no, sorry, I know the big steel mill is actually in India, but we think we own 40% of that because the man died in England. That is so difficult to collect that. And you would also have to find money. A lot of the non-doms in the UK possibly had money in Swiss bank accounts or Cayman Islands companies.
Sure.
The HMRC would need a whole division of people flying around the world trying to find this money. So it would probably cost you more to collect than you'd get if you ever found it. Then you'd be tied up with legal problems where the countries where the assets were based would not be interested in the UK trying to collect that money. So it was a really dumb tax, but it has caused a major flight. And the Financial Times is claiming that only 25% of people left because of expectations where 25% would leave. And another report has said 25% is the baseline. If you lose more than that, you will get less revenue than you were collecting before. So it's crazy that we've actually got to that borderline. So if one more non-dom leaves, we're going to start losing money from this tax. It's a really silly tax.
So if you were Rachel Reeves, can the dilemma that you face be solved by changing tax policy, or does it have to rest on reducing spending as well?
She has to reduce spending eventually, but the things that she can do that are in her remit, and she can do them very quickly, is she can, do what the government did before. If she's too scared to just abolish stamp duty, then she should do a stamp duty holiday. Because one of the biggest benefits to the economy in terms of a multiplier effect is house building, because it's something that's much harder to import. The labourers have to be here. The land has to be here. This is a great way to get the economy moving, is to just say, okay, we're not going to tax your house. We're not going to tax your primary residence. We're not going to tax stamp duty. Buy and sell it, you please. They don't raise a lot of money through this. It's 1.5% of all taxes raised. And yet you're slowing down an industry that is really important to the country. And it employs a lot of people. And we still make a lot of the goods used to build houses or extend houses. When people move, not only do they buy new furniture and paint and decorate curtains, often they upgrade kitchens. But these days, a lot of people are also adding extensions and doing all sorts of other things to the housing. All of that is employing brick makers and roof tile makers, and that's in the UK. When people talk about the ceramics industry, a lot of people think they're talking about wonderful china plates and things, which we do make, and that's a good industry. But we also make ceramics also covers bricks and roof tiles and basins and baths, loos. All of that sort of ceramics is a big part of what the UK does. It's an industry that is being taxed very heavily with our carbon taxes, carbon emissions, because obviously firing.
Big consumer of energy as well.
Yeah, big consumer of energy. So that we're now going to put a CBAM on anything we import to protect it, or at least we were. But now the Labor government wants us to adopt the EU CBAM, which does not cover the ceramics industry, which is incredible to me that we have two industries left here that are worth preserving, the glass and ceramic industry, that will not be covered by the EU CBAM if we adopt their CBAM, which is mind-boggling that no one in the government's worked that out.
I want to come on and talk about trade while staying on the UK just briefly. When a government in the future has to go about right-sizing the UK state and UK government spending, which areas of spending would you focus on?
The most important one is the welfare spending, because it has grown so enormously since the lockdown. And that is something that the government's really got to look into. Some of it could be...
Kind of tried, didn't it?
Well, I don't think anyone has really tried.
Okay.
I think that the fact that you can still apply for a disability over the phone without actually having to turn up at an office or have someone come to your house and see that you are, in fact, disabled is ridiculous. The fact that we have so many people who have worked out that they are better off not working and claiming all of the benefits they can get under universal credit, which is better than what they would get if they were working. And that makes no sense. There's a sort of a meme going around and people immediately say, oh, I'd change the triple lock on pensions. But pensioners get a lot less than the unemployed people on universal credit. I think they get about half. I have to work it out. I was going to put a graph together to show that. The problem is not the triple lock.
The point I was trying to make is that there is no political will currently to address this issue in the slightest. I mean, there was a backbench rebellion that prevented the government from slowing down the rate of increase, as I understand it, which was minuscule. A
lot of that is because the government doesn't explain it clearly to either the man in the street or to their backbenchers. And they have to accept they seem to have a lot of innumerate backbenchers. And they do have to basically say, look, this is the problem, this great lump of money that goes out. And we have an extraordinarily large proportion of the population who are technically getting this. Even people who are working are often getting in-work benefits. So they get benefits as well as they're working. And some of it you could change quite easily. Instead of giving people money, give them more in tax credits. So they would have to be working first before they could get that tax credit. But if you allow people to not work or to work a little bit and get given extra money, then there's no incentive for them to work a bit more. I think that is our biggest and most pressing problem. Back to pensions, the unfunded pensions of government employees are not killing us yet, but they will kill us within about 10 years' time. And no one seems to want to address that. Most obviously, the government employees who are designing these new taxes don't want to mention that their huge unfunded tax pensions are coming down the train pretty quickly. That money's got to be found from somewhere.
So if you add that to the national debt, it's 50, 60% more, something like that?
Well, yes, so I've heard. I haven't done those calculations myself, but I have seen them from other economists, and I do think that sounds about right. There are a lot of things that are not included in our national debt because we don't really count them.
Sort of off-balance sheet debt.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I went to Argentina is that I'm a bit of a Malay fanboy, and I'm a big fan of what he's been doing, and I just wanted to go over and see what was happening, and it was amazing. I loved it. But it's not plain sailing. I mean, he's chopped the heavy wood, but he's now got the more sort of nuanced and delicate job of re-entering the global financial system and bringing the peso back into sort of full convertibility. I think at some stage there are going to be some interesting lessons to learn from what Malay has been doing, and I strongly hope that he succeeds and gets re-elected in a couple of years' time to really finish the project. But, does the UK need a Malay, and could you envisage one existing?
I think the UK desperately needs a Malay, and like you, I'm a big fan of his. I particularly liked when he stood in front of a blackboard with all of the different government departments on the blackboard and picked one up and threw them in the bin. Go, we don't need that anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what the UK has to do. I wish we had a politician with that kind of balls is the word I was thinking of. But anyhow, I don't know if you can say that on your podcast.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely. Yeah.
The only one I see actually doing that would be Farage. I don't see Kemi doing it, mainly because she still is listening to government advisors who are all the people stuck on the blackboard. They are the departments that you have to chuck into the bin. Yeah. And until she's prepared to do her own research, make her own decisions and walk away from the government advice, I don't see that happening, though I would encourage her definitely. And if she wants help doing that, I'm here. But we've had this massive growth within each department of unnecessary jobs. And a lot of the stuff about diversity and inclusion and the ESG things, which have not just in government departments, they've invaded the private sector as well. And these are ridiculous in the UK. I've lived in a lot of countries around the world and a lot of different European countries. I've never been to a place that is as diverse as the UK and as open and friendly and happy about that diversity as the UK. And the idea that we need to have a diversity officer sitting in a government department, somehow or other making sure the NHS is diverse enough, when if you look at the official statistics published by the House of Commons on the nationalities of people employed in the NHS, you would have trouble finding any country not listed there, with the exception maybe of the United States, because they can earn so much more money in the US, they're never going to come here. It's incredible. Very impoverished African countries provide the UK with doctors and nurses.
Yes, absolutely.
I am shocked by it. But at the same time, when I discover that the NHS pays 3 times as much to a diversity officer as it pays to one of those nurses from Malawi, I sit there thinking that is just insane. Every one of those people has to go. There is the idea that we don't understand diversity and we need an officer organising that for us is rubbish. When you look through the financial services regulations, so many of them had the same sort of stuff. And the stock market wanted companies to explain how they were going to deal with stranded assets in 100 years' time and what they were doing to prevent climate change in 100 years' time. And the average life expectancy for a UK company listed on the stock exchange was 8.5 years.
I was going to say less than 10 years, I would think, yeah.
And it's like, so why are we worried about what's going to happen in 100 years and demanding that they have a plan for this? The very funny thing has been that the company with the stranded assets due to climate change turns out to be the Danish company that is making wind turbines. So they are the first company to have stranded assets, and it's a wind company. It's not,
Can we finish by talking about trade and tariffs? What do you make of the Trump tariff regime? Does it make sense at all from a US perspective? Is he mad or is he just playing 4D chess?
No, I think he's the smartest guy in the room. I am a big fan of Trump as well as Malay. What people, especially the economists and the news readers and the commentators, the Newsnight people complaining about tariffs, they are morons of the first order, because they all seem to assume that the UK is a tariff-free zone. They all think the UK is running this free trade.
And the EU is one big free market, of course.
Yeah. They're all free here. And terrible Trump has put up his tariffs by 5%. And the reality is the exact opposite. For 50 plus years, the US has had minimal tariffs on almost everything, and watch the rest of the world put massive tariffs and non-tariff barriers on all of their goods. I've just written the paper for the Prosperity Institute on the potential for US-UK trade, because I'd like to see us do a proper full trade agreement. So I'm very pleased with the one we've done.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, even with the addition of the 10% from the US, our tariffs on almost all food is still considerably higher than any US tariff.
But we've done a deal with the US. The EU have done a deal with the US. Our relative position seems to be quite favourable. How much of an advantage is this? And I guess the follow-on question is, are we putting that in peril by sort of trying to forge closer links to Europe at the same time as having this favoured nation status with the US?
I'm very worried that they will. I mean, so far, Trump hasn't really noticed it. And the EU has also claimed that they will open up their markets to US agricultural goods. The UK should have done a much more comprehensive deal with the US. And in the original documentation, they did claim that they would look at other agricultural goods, because people get upset about chlorinated chicken, which is a complete misnomer. But the US produces so much more food, many of which we're already importing, such as soybeans and corn, because we can't grow either here. Also, we could get oranges and orange juice from the US. We have 30% tariffs on orange juice. We've kept those tariffs high, even though you can't grow oranges or produce orange juice in the UK, but that's to protect Spanish farmers, and we've kept that there. So there's a whole lot of rubbish in our tariff agreements that were designed to protect other people in Europe. And we've maintained them, even though they make every consumer in the UK a little bit poorer. And that is why I think the US deal is a good one for us. Besides protecting our biggest exports to the US, which were always aircraft parts and cars, and was our high value, expensive cars, the Range Rovers, the Aston Martins, the Rolls-Royce, they were the ones we were exporting to the US. And also the Rolls-Royce engines were going to the US. Not so much the plane parts, the landing gear and the wings tended to go first to Germany to be made into whole planes, Airbus planes, and then sent to the US. So they weren't always recorded in our exports to the US, but that's eventually where they turned up. But the best thing is the ethanol, because the UK was already importing 1.4 billion litres of ethanol every year, which we started doing 2 or 3 years ago, because we now add it to petrol, and it's a compulsory additive to petrol. It is debatable whether this is really green. It's a little bit like burning wood pellets, but at the same time, it can be a useful fuel for running cars. In Brazil, there are cars that run on 100% ethanol because ethanol is very cheap to produce in Brazil, although they just found a big oil find just off the coast, so they may get out of the ethanol business. But right now, we were already importing that, and we're importing it mainly from the US and Brazil because they make it with corn and with sugarcane, which are the most efficient ways to make ethanol. The UK had a very small factory. It was only producing about 253 million litres of ethanol each year, and they were making it with wheat, which is the worst or the least yielding way to make ethanol. So they were using kind of the wrong crop, and we don't have a large amount of farmland, arable land for growing crops in the UK. One state in the US, Iowa, has twice as much arable land as the whole of the UK. And yet, for some reason, we want to produce our own ethanol here. And the factory producing it wants the government to subsidize it when you're going, no, we can import that from the US. But weirdly, we were adding 24% tariffs onto the ethanol we imported from the US. Now, if you think about it, this is why I think this trade deal will benefit the man in the street more than any other we've done. Because all of the others that the Conservatives did were trying to protect UK farmers. And so they are taking off the tariffs and increasing the quotas very slowly over long periods of time. Whereas the ethanol, A, is coming off immediately, and B, people who drive cars should notice the difference. Now, Rachel Reeves will probably increase the fuel tax. I would say this is going to happen 100%, which I think is ridiculously high, and especially when that's added to petrol that now contains 10% ethanol, which had 24% tariffs on it. So they've reduced the ethanol bit to zero. I don't think it's even worth a bet. It's such a surefire thing that they'll increase the petrol duty from 52p to 55p or something. And that will, in fact, make up for the saving on ethanol. On the bright side, I think the government is not going to subsidise the UK's ethanol production facility, which is a blessing if we at least have one less subsidy to pay for. But it is kind of crazy. So I'm a fan of that deal. We are better off than the EU because we are paying 10% tariffs on our goods going to the US, where they are paying 15%. But the main goods that we're sending are either cars, which are 10% rather than 25%, and plane parts, which are now zero. And so for our big exports to the US, they're doing really well. There will be other people that will be going, oh, well, I used to export one cheese with zero tariffs on it. Now it's got 10% tariffs on it. And that's true, but they were never big exports. The UK's big exports by an enormous amount is something called machinery and transport equipment. And for our goods, that is our biggest export. And that's the thing we have to protect.
And of course, our biggest export is services. And that's
that's true. Bigger than the machinery, which is our biggest goods export, is what they call other business services, which is legal and accounting and consulting,
Huge. It's huge.
architects.
Yeah.
And that's huge now. That is 58% of all of UK exports are service exports. And that's the biggest part of our service exports.
So has the global trading system, we started talking about your interest as a child in Australia as how world trade works. Put what Trump has done since April this year, the policy he's put in place, in the context of the global trading system? Has it changed permanently? And if you were running UK trade policy, what would your priorities be in relation to that world trading system?
I think that it has changed a lot. Trump has done two things. People seem to forget that the reason the US is the apex consumer of imported goods and that every company all around the world wants to sell to the US is because they didn't have a sales tax. They didn't have VAT added to their products by the federal government. Some of the states do apply sales taxes, but they are usually quite small. They're applied at the retail level, and other states have no sales tax. So it depends on where you live. And so what Trump has really done is adding a VAT of 10% to imported goods, which gives domestic producers an advantage if they choose to use it. Because he realized, as did the UK, or the UK should have realized, during COVID, how reliant the US was on imports from China. And this is a national security risk, and that is why he's applied the biggest tariffs of 25% on steel and aluminium and cars as a national security tariff, which is a 232 tariff, Section 232. Because in a time of war, you cannot rely on your most likely adversary, which is probably China, to supply you with the steel to make the planes to go and bomb China. You know, it's just not going to happen. And the UK should have realized that as well. We've allowed China to buy up a lot of our important infrastructure, not just the steel works, but they're now trying to buy Thames Water, and they own a lot of our infrastructure. We also discovered in the UK, as the US did, is our car production dropped because we relied on China to supply the semiconductors used in the cars, so that a car that was worth £60,000 couldn't be sold because they were waiting for a $600 computer chip to arrive. And that's the ridiculous thing about relying on China, is you need that supply to be secure all the time. You can't have the country say, oh, well, sorry, we're trying to get rid of COVID, so we're going to close our factories, even though everyone else in the world has opened theirs. So that happened for semiconductors. And so the whole world is now building semiconductor factories, which the US has done very successfully. But we've also discovered active pharmaceutical ingredients also come from China. And that is a major problem because pharmaceuticals is one of the UK's bigger export industries. And the idea that we can design the drug and do the research and development and do all of this, but we rely on the very basic active ingredients to be made in China. So the concept of bringing a lot of the essential industries back into the US is a good one. Some of the things he's done seem a bit strange. I would have encouraged him not just to annex Canada and Mexico, but really become their best friends.
Yeah.
I mean, China has got into both of those markets, A, because they're an easy backdoor into the US market, but B, I think that China was willing to buy that devotion, if you like. They've had a very long game of going around the world to developing nations, third world nations, and doing deals with the powers that be, buying up the mines, developing the mines, importing Chinese workers to run the mines.
Sure.
So the native populations aren't even getting any money out of it. The ruler might get paid something for the access to the mine, but we are finding that it's not spreading the wealth in the way, like them or hate them, the way the old colonial system used to work, where a UK mining company might go into one of these countries, but they would employ the local workers to work in the mine. Now, I know a lot of people find that that's abhorrent, but you sit there looking at the alternative and go, well, the Chinese bring in their own workers so that there's no money going into the local economy. Do you think that's a better system? And I'm not sure that it is, but anyhow, that's what they're doing. So I think there's a lot of method in Trump's madness. And I think that the key is the fact that the US has realized that they cannot be the world's dominant superpower if you're relying on your adversaries to supply you with the elements to make your superpower machinery.
What should the UK response be to this in sort of terms of priority?
I would suggest the UK get really chummy with the US. We have always been together on most things. We've always supported each other in wars. As I said earlier, we both believe in Anglo-Saxon capitalism. Trump is going to be subsidizing and encouraging steel production back into the US, and the UK needs steel. We should be buying it from the US. We have to do a deal. In the same way that Trump's done a deal, we should go and say, okay, this is the deal. We are presently importing X amount of steel from China. We'll convert that to you guys, provided you buy, whatever. When we turn the steel into plane parts, you buy the plane parts.
Yes.
We've got to start.
It's sort of a fracturing of the global economy, isn't it?
Yeah. And do mutual things with people you can trust.
Sure. And I guess to end on a positive, hopefully, it's almost being served up to us on a silver platter. I mean, J.D. Vance seems desperate to help in his way for the UK. The man leading the opinion polls to be the next prime minister of this country is Trump's mate. And we've got this trade deal. I mean, we should be in a fantastic position, as you say, to be their best friends and really realize the potential of the sort of Singapore-on-Thames version of post-Brexit Britain, which we seem to be just afraid of embracing.
It is kind of incredible how people find the idea of Singapore-on-Thames so emotive. Weirdly, most of the people who get angry about that have obviously never been to Singapore. It does encourage a lot of trade, but it also has a draconian law and order sort of attitude that I think a lot of the left-wing people presently running our government would die for.
Of course, yeah, absolutely, yes.
That's the sort of government they want to be,
Yeah.
Despot.
I don't know who it was. Someone said I voted for Singapore-on-Thames, but we got Belarus. Catherine, I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I could chat for much longer.
Yeah, we could actually.
Let's do this again because I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and hopefully we can just chew the fat, not a lot more stuff. But I read your Substack.
I should start doing a podcast and I'll interview you because I have a suspicion talking to you, you know a hell of a lot about this. You probably have.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay.
More
Let's do a
informed.
collab. Absolutely. Yeah. I read your Substack. Thank you very much for doing it. And I would urge anyone listening to this to find your Substack, which I think is Catherine McBride at Substack. I don't know.
It is Catherine McBride Substack because I didn't realize I might need a better name.
Fine.
I said
you probably don't. You don't.
And now I think maybe I should change the name, but it's a bit late.
Well, I don't know. It works for me. I don't mean this in a bad way. It's very dense. You write in a very dense style. There's a lot of information in there. And I think it really is refreshing, albeit somewhat challenging at times, to actually read on subjects of such vital importance that most media outlets, including the big well-known names like the Financial Times, just skate over. So thank you for doing that. And I look forward to catching up with you in the not too distant future.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.